Welcome again to Mormon Scriptural Explorations. Today we're taking a look at the second half of 1 Nephi 8, which focuses on the Great and Spacious Building. Now, it's divided into several little sections. The first one talks about the iron rod and the path, and that's in 8:19 to 22. Lehi says he beheld a rod of iron that extended along the bank and led to the tree. This is all pretty straightforward in terms of just the narrative, although the symbolic meaning and some of the ideas behind it might not always be clear. The rod of iron here is an idea that is reflected in other passages in both the Book of Mormon and the Bible. In 1 Nephi 13:5, the great and abominable church yokes its people with a yoke of iron. So they essentially chain them down with this yoke that makes them do what the great and abominable church wants. So notice the rod of iron in Nephi is something that guides to the tree of life, but the yoke of iron is something that enslaves for the great and abominable church. And then elsewhere, God uses a rod of iron, which he essentially like a staff or a mace or a club. That's seen reflected here. So this rod of iron can have a negative or a positive sense depending on who's using it and what it's being used for. But it's essentially like a banister or rail that goes along the river and leads to the tree of life. Now notice in the next verse, 20, he beheld a straight and narrow path. Now the rod and the path go side by side, and both lead to the tree. Now in the earliest text of the Book of Mormon we have, the term is not straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, but is rather straight, S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T. Straight means narrow or constricted, whereas straight with a G-H-T means linear or completely aligned and not bending or curving. So the path is not a narrow path, but a straight, undeviating path that leads along the rod of iron. And both go to the tree. And he also notices a fountain, which we'll get back to. This fountain is a spring, and it is the source of the water flowing in the river that flows by the tree. Now, at this point, however, Lehi's view of things changes, because before he'd been talking only about himself going to the tree, then it's his family and what their relationship to the tree is, and now it turns into a world. That is, he's now shifting to a cosmic view. If you will, the camera's pulling back up into the sky and looking down over the whole scene, as opposed to Lehi's immediate circumstances. The idea about the straight and narrow is covered in these two articles here. You can go find them on my bibliography and take a look if you're interested. So, in the cosmic perspective now, not just Lehi and his family are there, but numberless courses of people. That is, can't count them, basically. And they're all pressing forward. This phrase, pressing forward, means that they're trying to go forward fast, hard, making a great effort to go forward. Might refer to a crowded circumstance as well. But notice, all the people are moving towards something, and that is the tree. But what they first have to do is get to the path, which leads to the tree. Now notice the path is really what leads to the tree. The rod, we'll see, plays a different function. It's not what guides to the tree. It's what takes you through the darkness. So they come forward, they find the path, they start walking along the path. And the initial part of the path doesn't have anything to do with the iron rod. It's simply there's a path, they can see the tree in the distance, and if they follow the path, they'll get to the tree. That's what they're trying to do. So what I think is, as I read through this, is that we tend to focus on the iron rod and the way we discuss this in ordinary church circumstances, and there's nothing wrong with that. But anciently, if you look at the broad system of symbols used in ancient times, the path or the way was what was far more important. The function of the iron rod is to get you through the mist of darkness, not to get you to the tree. The path leads to the tree. When you go into the darkness, you can't see the path anymore. Therefore, you grab onto the rod so that you can stick on the path, even though it's dark. There's the mist of darkness. So I think that's an important concept to understand. And that ties this in much better than with the biblical allegory of the two ways, which is it's found everywhere in the Bible, that there are two ways that you can take. One is the way of the Lord, the other is the way of folly, or all sorts of different names it's called. But there are always two ways or two paths. And Max Sterling here is an article in the Journal Book of Mormon Studies, which goes into great depth, a really brilliant analysis of the way of death and the way of life in the Book of Mormon. That's the two ways. Notice, too, that if you read the book of Acts, the original name of the church was the Way of Christ, or the Way of the Lord. It wasn't called the Christian church or anything else. It was the way. This is the way that God wants you to go. And of course, the way of the Lord is the pathway that leads to the temple. And so the way here is what you have to follow. The iron rod helps you follow the way in certain circumstances. So what happens now is all these people are pressing forward as the great mist arises, and it covers everything with darkness, and people are on the path, but because they can't see anymore, they get lost. So the first group that gets lost are those who fail to grasp the iron rod when they enter into the darkness, because they can't see the path anymore. What exactly this symbolizes is hard to say, but it may be the fact that in the time of Lehi there were multiple groups of prophets and prophesying different things. One group saying the Babylonians were going to come and destroy the city if they didn't repent. The other group saying, no, the Lord will protect the city. And so if you're on the path, they're both Israelite groups, but they're not quite sure which prophetic group to follow. It's hard to say. I mean, it's probably a much broader symbol than that. Now, another group comes forward. So one group gets into the darkness and wanders off. The next group, or other people in general, probably happening simultaneously, they take the iron rod. And notice they take the end of the iron rod. That's interesting language there. It's used elsewhere in 830. It seems to indicate the rod has an ending and a beginning, and that it doesn't go all the way, but it's just part of the way on the path. Anyway, they take the rod and they just hold on to this while they go through the darkness, and that can take them out. So when they come forth out of the mist of darkness, they partake of the tree. And again, this is pretty straightforward symbolism here. So in my understanding of this, the path leads to the tree, and the purpose of the iron rod is to guide you through the mist of darkness. Now, the next great symbol that appears here is the Great and Spacious Building. And remember, I'm not, at this point, I'm just looking at what Lehi has to say. I'm not looking at the broader interpretation that pops up in Nephi. So we're just looking at chapter 8 in and of itself as if that's all we know about the subject. And then we'll, proceed from there. So another group, now this group that arrives at the tree is split up. And some of them take the fruit, but then they are ashamed, and we don't know why they're ashamed of taking the fruit. And this phrase is mentioned elsewhere, but we quickly find out why. Lehi looks around, and now suddenly he sees something new. And this is interesting how this is described. He doesn't kind of see everything all at once. His view and perspective is constantly shifting and focusing on different things. Now, on the other side of the river, that's across the river from the tree, there was a great and spacious building. What exactly this is kind of explained later on, but in my view, the great and spacious building is the apostate temple of Jerusalem. I can't really argue for this until we've read Nephi's account. He says it's the pride of the world and things like that. But if you want to look for a specific antecedent, it's the temple, but it's the apostate temple, and that's the problem. What had happened at the temple during this period is that Jeremiah, who was a temple priest and was supposed to go in there and function as a priest, had been cast out of the temple, that is, being cast out of the presence of the Lord in a ritual sense, and basically was excommunicated. So the temple was in apostasy. They were worshiping, foreign gods, foreign idols, using improper ritual, all that type of stuff, as well as following false prophets. So in this apostate state, the temple has become the great and spacious building. And as I said, I can't really argue for this until I get to Nephi's account, but think about it for now. There's a nice article, too, about kind of architectural background to a great and spacious building. Now, it's filled with people, and all that they describe about them is, number one, they have fine dress, and number two, they're mocking those who believe. Now, of course, the group that was mocking Lehi were the Jews of Jerusalem. So, in his immediate historical context, that's the type of people he's talking about. And the fine dress points to aristocrats, wealthy, royalty, and priests. These are the guys who would have had fancy dress in Lehi's time. The Book of Mormon mentions it's the pride of the world, and in the ancient Near East, extravagant dress was widely seen, universally seen, as a sign of pride and worldliness. And so, we think of nice clothing as something you want to wear to church. Nice clothing was viewed in the ancient world as something extremely rare. Only the extraordinarily rich could own it, and it was a mechanism by which you showed your superiority to those around you. And in many ways, that's still what fancy clothes do today. So you've got this group, wealthy, proud, mocking, and the people who taste the fruit are ashamed because of these people mocking them, and so they fall away to forbidden paths. So this is the second group that is lost, and that is those who partake of the tree. They make it through the midst of darkness, but they wander off into forbidden paths. And again, notice the two-path motif. There's another path leading away from the tree, and it's a false one. It's one that leads to destruction. So if you look at the context of all of this, the people who were mocking Lehi at this time were the elite Jews of Jerusalem. And notice, too, they are the ones who had drawn Laman and Lemuel away from accepting his prophetic mission. That is to say, Laman and Lemuel, as we talked about earlier, followed the ideology that the Lord would save his temple in the end, that it could not be destroyed. And this was in direct contradiction to Jeremiah's prophetic message as well as Lehi's. So notice that context of who was mocking Lehi and who is mocking in the dream seems to fit together, as well as the biggest building known to Lehi would have been the Temple of Jerusalem. So when you talk about a great big building, that would be it. Now, Nephi makes a short insert here, just saying he's now summarizing and abridging, and this discussion of abridgment is picked up again in 1 Nephi 9, where I'll discuss it in more detail. So, now he sees, he's back kind of to the righteous group. They press forward, they catch hold of, again, the end of the rod of iron. It seems to have an end and a beginning. They make it to the tree, but now notice what they do. They fall down and partake of the fruit of the tree. Now, this is an extraordinarily strange statement, because if you come to a tree, you don't fall down to get the fruit. You have to stand up and stretch and reach up to grab the fruit. So why would people fall down to take the fruit? Well, obviously, this is symbolic. So they come forth out of the midst of darkness. The path has taken them to the tree, and their immediate reaction is to fall down. Now, in an ancient context, falling down means to prostrate yourself in an act of worship. This is a ritual act of prostration before the tree, because, of course, the tree symbolizes God. And so, this makes a perfect sense in an allegorical setting, because the tree symbolizes the presence of God, whereas in in just a purely natural setting, you don't fall down to grab fruit from a tree. So that seems to be what's going on here in this context. Now, others, so there's lots of groups here, and while he's seeing this one group that prostrates itself to the tree, others intentionally go towards the great and spacious building. They follow that way, and again, the way is used here, the idea of the way. So there's a way to the tree, a way to the great and spacious building. And note also that it says there's multitudes feeling their way. In the original edition, the word is pressing. This is, again, the pressing forward idea. So everybody's doing the same thing. They're marching forward, they're pressing forward towards a goal. For some, the goal is the tree. For others, the goal is the great and spacious building. And there are paths or ways that lead to both. And this is classic two-way language, two-way allegory from the Bible, which is one of the foundational metaphors of the Bible, is the two ways. Now, others are drowned in the depths of the fountain. And it's not clear at this point what that fountain is, but what seems to be the case is that there's two fountains. Now, it's not explicit in Lehi's dream. There's the fountain of waters that flows by the tree of life, but there seems to be another one that is described by Nephi in 12:16 as a fountain of filthy waters, and this seems to be the one. So, although Lehi doesn't make it explicit, I'm pretty certain there are two different fountains implied in his dream. And then other group wanders into strange roads. Now, this idea of strange is important to take a look at. And it's also, I think Lehi is talking about two different things here. Some go to forbidden paths in 8:28, but others go to strange roads in 8:32. And as I'll argue in a second, this strange, I think, means foreign, that is non-Jewish, non-Israelite. So I think the forbidden paths are things that are unlawful to Jews, whereas the foreign path is actively following pagan beliefs, practices, and cultic activities. So it's two different things. One is simply failing to follow the law of the Jews, and the other is actively following the pagan practices. Conceptualized then as two different parts of this wandering in the foreign or the strange or the forbidden roads. Now, if you look at the Book of Mormon here, you get several different descriptions of people who are lost. Some don't ever grasp the iron rod. Some take of the tree but wander off. That is, they don't maintain their presence there. They don't stay with the tree. Others are drowned in the filthy fountain, and others wander off into strange roads. So there's lots of different types of ways that people get lost within the allegory itself. Now, he flips back again to the group that's in the Great and Spacious Building, and the people that are following the path to the Great and Spacious Building now can enter it. But it's now called a strange building rather than a Great and Spacious Building. That is, its original description focuses on its size, but this description now focuses on its foreignness or strangeness. And I think this again points to the adoption of foreign temple cult in the Jerusalem temple. That is, the temple is strange or foreign because they are practicing some of the rituals and worshiping the gods and having idols in the temple that are foreign, that is non-Israelite. They are not being loyal to Yahweh. And this is pretty clear from both Jeremiah and Ezekiel that this was going on. I mean, there's no question about it from that perspective. So, when you look at the word strange in the Book of Mormon and also the King James Bible, it does not mean, like it does today, unusual, weird, or different, but it means foreign. So in the 16th century, strange meant foreign. Book of Mormon always uses it that way, so does the King James Version. And in the King James Version, strange translates the Hebrew nakar, which means foreign. Doesn't mean unusual or weird. So when you have a strange or foreign road in the Book of Mormon, or a strange or foreign building, it means foreign, not unusual. And I take it then that this emphasis on the idea of foreignness implies the problem that the Jews were facing of following non-Jewish beliefs, gods, cultic activities, and cultural practices, both in daily life and also in the temple. So the foreignness of the building points again, I think, to it being a temple there. Now, Lehi is always flipping back and forth, kind of like focusing on different aspects of it. And now he's back on those who listen to the people who are mocking, also fall away. And heeded them, the them are those in the Great and Spacious Building. Now notice, those who heed those in the people in the Great and Spacious Building fall away, and Laman and Lemuel never even partake of the fruit. They're heeding those in the Great and Spacious Building, meaning they basically agree with the perspective and temple ideology of the Jerusalem elites, which we discussed earlier. And this again points to Lehi's concern with his immediate family rather than the cosmic picture. When Nephi engages these ideas, he is much more focused on the cosmic issues. So the dream is essentially over, and what Lehi is concerned with is Laman and Lemuel did not partake of the fruit. They're following the mockers in the Great and Spacious Building. So he finishes the dream, and then he says he feared for Laman and Lemuel, and the reason he fears is because they didn't partake of the fruit, and because of that, that means to him that they will be cast off from the presence of the Lord. Now notice, if you go back to 2:21, this is exactly the punishment that is prophesied that will result from failure to keep Nephi's covenant. The Lord makes a covenant with Nephi. If you keep the commandments, you will prosper in the land. But if you fail to keep the commandments, you will be cut off from the presence of the Lord. That's in 2:21 and the verses around it. So, the fact that Lehi sees Laman and Lemuel as being cast off from the presence of the Lord is linked in closely with this covenant. That is, they're not going to keep the covenant. He asks them to hearken to his words. He says, please believe me. Please obey my words. Hearken means obey, and they don't. He also makes a number of prophecies. And these are described, I think, in 1 Nephi 10. They're not given here. And then he encourages them to keep the commandments of the Lord, which in 2:20 is exactly what you have to do to follow Nephi's covenant. So 2:20 says, keep the commandments of the Lord. And 2:21 says, if you don't, you will be cast off from the presence of the Lord. And these are exactly the phrases Lehi is using in this dream. I guess it's actually Nephi describing Lehi's dream. And this is another great case of intertextuality in the Book of Mormon where it's quoting itself.